Rick, thank you so much for doing this and talking about this book. I've got great questions, I hope, but I mostly want to get you talking about the Revolutionary War and come to questions from the room. Let me ask you this. Volume 1, The British Are Coming, starts overseas, starts in Great Britain, begins in England with King George. Volume 2 begins in Paris. Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, Ben Franklin. First lines of books matter, I think, at least for lovers of books. Why begin both books so far away from America?
Yeah, well, that's a good question, Kevin. Thank you, first of all, for doing the heavy lifting. Thank you all for being here this evening. I think that I opened Volume 1 in London because I've got a lot of information that the reader needs to know without me cramming it down their throats and starting way back in time with the Stamp Act or whatever before the Revolution. I'm a military historian. I write about war. I want to get to the war. London turns out to be a good place to introduce central characters, including Benjamin Franklin, who is going to be our first and ultimately greatest diplomat. And then the British king, George III, our last king. I want to get him on the stage quickly because he's a vital component in understanding why the war begins and why the war goes as it does for 8 years. And then for Volume 2, I open in Paris and then Versailles because I want the French to come onto the stage full force. We've seen them in Volume 1, but the success or failure of the revolution is going to depend on whether or not the French are going to come into the war on the American side openly and with a full commitment. And so I want you to meet Louis XVI. I want you to meet his queen, Marie Antoinette. And we happen to have Franklin there again. And then there's a 19-year-old Frenchman named Gilbert du Motier. I want you to meet him too. You know him better as the Marquis de Lafayette, because in that same period he is going to be leaving France against the king's orders to come to America because he's got a commission as a major general in the Continental Army. All these people need to come on the stage, and the place to get them on the stage is in France.
Book 1 of the trilogy, The British Are Coming, where did you leave that one off, and how did you know where to break the volumes? First, set the stage for where the war left off, but also, how did you decide where to cut from Volume 1 to Volume 2?
Yeah, as a narrative writer, I'm always looking for the story, and I'm trying to look at it with a jeweler's eye, seeing the facets like a jeweler looks at the facets of a stone. And to me, the American Revolution story cleaves very neatly where I end Volume 1, and that's with when the days are darkest and when George Washington writes to his brother and says, I think the game is pretty near up. That's in December of 1776. And then he saves the day basically with a surprise attack on the Hessian rear guard detachment at Trenton and destroys that detachment, and then doubles down, which is a very bold thing for him to do, and he crosses back into New Jersey again and baits the British into attacking him, and then loops back around and destroys the British rearguard garrison at Princeton. These are two victories that are absolutely vital to the cause, and then Washington takes the army to northern New Jersey, and they go into winter quarters, and nothing much happens for 5 months. So that's a great place to stop. And that's a great place for everyone to catch their breath, and then for me to pitch into Volume 2.
I will certainly come back to Washington, and I want to talk about some of the other towering figures in Volume 2. But let me ask you about the common soldier. I was really struck by the accounts here, both of their sort of material conditions, but also of a comment that Baron von Steuben makes to a friend in Prussia, where he writes, he says, "You say to your soldier," writing again to Prussia, "do this," and he does it, but I am obliged to say, this is the reason why you ought to do that, and then he does it here in America. Tell us about the Continental soldier, the rank and file.
Yeah, that insight by Steuben, I think, would be familiar to any officer in the military today. You don't just order, you frequently have to have a cogent reason behind what you're asking soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines to do today. There's something in the American character that wants to know why you're being asked to risk it all. And Steuben sees that right away. And differentiates the American soldier from those he's been accustomed to in Europe. So the American soldier changes quite quickly in the American Revolution. The Continental Army initially, formed in 1775 with George Washington as the first commander, is composed in part with freeholders and what we would today recognize as the middle class of tradesmen and people of some affluence of property. And their enthusiasm for the cause really fades quickly after 1776, and the composition of the Army changes pretty dramatically over the next couple of years, the years that this book, the second volume, covers, so that we have the unemployed, we have new immigrants, particularly Irish Protestants, who have been driven to America by crop failures and a collapse of the weaving industry in Ireland, by the shiftless. In some cases, they need the $6 a month that a private earns in the Continental Army. And so the Army really becomes a different creature. It's a challenge for Washington and the rest of the officer corps. Because they're dealing with a different demographic than the one that they had been accustomed to initially.
I first met you when I was working at George Washington's Mount Vernon, and you were hard at work on Volume 1, and then it came out, and we all began to know even more about the Revolutionary War. The time that I've spent with George Washington leaves me feeling like I know him pretty well, but I feel like I got to know him even better here. Tell me about your impression of George Washington as a commander and as a person.
Yeah, you know, I had the privilege, Kevin, of living metaphorically with Dwight Eisenhower for almost 15 years and writing a trilogy about the American role in the liberation of Europe in World War II. And I feel like I got to know him pretty well as a general and as a man. And I have the same relationship with Washington now. We're 12 years into this metaphorical relationship. And in both cases, I find that my admiration for them grows the more that I know them. I recognize Washington's flaws, and they are manifest. The man who proverbially could never tell a lie certainly could prevaricate, particularly when he's trying to explain to Congress the latest defeat. He's not a particularly gifted tactician. He makes a lot of mistakes on the battlefield. He doesn't see the battlefield spatially and temporally the way a quote-unquote great captain does, like a Napoleon. And so he makes errors. He makes errors in not going out and doing reconnaissance of battlefields at New York in August of 1776, at Brandywine in September of 1777. The guy was a surveyor. You would think that he knew something about land, and yet he does not take the time to really understand the lay of the land, to understand the vulnerabilities that his army's got. And in both cases, he gets outflanked. And in both cases, he nearly loses his army. So these are deficiencies as a commander. Nevertheless, you know, it has to be said that he's got a number of sterling attributes, some of which he shares, frankly, with Eisenhower. He's very robust. He never seems to even catch cold for 8 years. This is a time when typhus, typhoid, smallpox, and all sorts of other communicable diseases are killing tens of thousands of people. That's very important for him to have that sturdiness. It makes people confident in him. He's got a commitment to the traits that people in the 1770s hold dear. He derives them from the Roman Republicans, whom he venerates. And they include such simple things as loyalty, truth-telling, commitment to a cause larger than himself. These are important. These are things we should demand from every leader today. And Washington shows us the way in the 1770s. He doesn't just talk the talk, he walks the walk. And so this is one of the reasons he is successful as a general. It's one of the reasons he's going to be successful as a president. His commitment to these basic values that are, they're not universally embraced by everybody in America, of course, but they recognize, the populace recognizes that Washington is indeed somebody worthy of admiration and sometimes even veneration.
You mentioned a low point of the war towards the end of Volume 1. One of the low points of the war also appears in this volume, and that's outside of Philadelphia in the winter. Major General Johannes de Kalb wrote from Valley Forge, "We have hardly been here 6 days and are already suffering for want of everything, and they're there much longer." Tell us about Valley Forge. What did you discover about their time there?
Yeah, well, Valley Forge is awful. There are 2,000 American soldiers who die in the winter at Valley Forge in 1777-78, and they die from disease, from malnutrition, from basic want. Washington's challenge, and that of his other officers, is to hold together an army that is really coming apart at the seams. They lack everything. They lack decent food. Horses and cattle are dying by the hundreds because they're dying of starvation. Men are deserting right and left. Washington writes, "We shall be forced to send out one half of the army to bring back the other half." Desertion is that serious. And 20 miles to the east in Philadelphia, the Brits have taken Philadelphia in the fall, and they're living very comfortably in occupied Philadelphia. That makes it all the more painful. So it is one of the nadirs of a war that has a lot of them. We're going to see at the end of this book, Charleston falls. A 5,000-man American army is captured or killed in Charleston. So again, you have this trough of despair where things look very dark, and certainly they never look darker than they do at Valley Forge.
Midway through this book, it becomes a book that had been set on land, and it's all of a sudden in the waves of the sea. And ships and sailors, the vocabulary changes dramatically. You must have had to have done some real work to better understand the 18th century nautical terminology. We discovered that you can do it. You can write about naval engagements with as much energy as you do land battles. So just give us the history. What happened in 1778 that got us to that set of chapters that feel like they're way at sea, and how did you grapple with it as a writer?
Yeah, well, the British have in the Royal Navy the greatest navy the world's ever seen. They have a tremendous navy. They have 300 warships. The Congress creates a continental navy, and it's worthless. They build 13 frigates. None of those frigates are around at the end of the war. They're either captured by the British, they're destroyed by the British, or they're burned by their own crews to avoid capture. So there is no real national navy. The Americans make up for it in part by providing letters of marque that permit legal piracy. And so if you're a fisherman in New England and you want to try and pick up some extra money, you can make a lot of money by acting as a pirate because you're authorized by either Congress or by the individual states. And there are going to be ultimately many hundreds of these bandits, as the British call them. And over the course of the war, they're going to capture or destroy more than 2,000 British ships. That's a lot, even for a seagoing nation like Britain. Now, there are a few bright moments for the Continental Navy. There's a young Scottish immigrant, a real hard-charging, able sailor named John Paul Jones. His name is really John Paul, but he kills a man in a fight on a ship that he's commanding, and he flees to America and adds Jones on the name to his name. No one will ever find him at that point. And he's commissioned early in the war, and we're going to see him in one of the great naval fights in American naval history. It's a relatively small scrap between two frigates off the eastern coast of England, but he's commanding the Bonhomme Richard, which is named after his good pal Benjamin Franklin, who's written Poor Richard's Almanac. And he encounters a new Navy frigate, the Serapis, and it is a Donnybrook to end all Donnybrooks. They slug it out for hours. Ultimately, Jones prevails by sheer desire not to lose. Tremendous casualties on both sides. He captures the Serapis and moves his surviving crew onto the Serapis just before the Bonhomme Richard sinks. So that's a bright spot, and the U.S. Navy continues to hold on to that as an emblem of the beginning of what is now the greatest Navy the world has ever seen. But for the most part, naval actions are left to these privateers. And they cause a lot of trouble for the British because they operate not just in American waters, but they're going to be operating also in European waters, particularly around Great Britain.
And naval actions are also left to the new ally, the French. So right at the end of Valley Forge, you've got a despairing army. Finally, springtime has arrived. But the other thing that arrives is news of that alliance. Tell us about the French entry.
Yeah, so Franklin has been in Paris, and his job, as dictated by the Congress, is to persuade the absolute Roman Catholic monarch in France, Louis XVI, that it's in his best interest to align himself and his nation with Protestant wannabe Republicans intent on the overthrow of their lawful monarch. That's a heavy lift diplomatically, and Franklin is quite brilliant as it turns out. He shows infinite patience. Franklin is by far and away the most famous American in the world as a consequence of his scientific discoveries. He's known throughout Europe. He arrives in France in December of 1776, and the adulation begins immediately. People run after his coach. There are little Franklin busts on every mantle in Paris. Women, he has this ratty marten skin cap that he got in Canada that he wears, and beautiful women in Paris are all wearing these faux marten caps atop their 3-foot bouffant hairdos. He persuades Louis XVI and his foreign minister, Vergennes, ultimately that it is in their best interest because what the French want to do is to avenge the losses that they've had in the previous war with Britain. We call it the French and Indian War. In Europe, it was called the 7 Years' War. It's a tremendous victory for Britain, and it's a tremendous, shameful defeat for France. And so Franklin convinces the French that the best way to stick it to the British, to reassert France's traditional role as the first among nations on the continent of Europe, and to cut the British down to size, is to align themselves with people who are already fighting the British, us. And after the Battle of Saratoga, where an entire British army is trapped and captured, the French come to the conclusion, these guys can do it. And they will come in and they will send not just clandestine support, which they've been doing for a couple of years, shipping gunpowder and muskets and so on, but send a navy, and ultimately they're going to send an army. It's why we win. The French help is ultimately decisive in the war.
One of my other favorite books about the Revolutionary War is by Andrew O'Shaughnessy, called The Men Who Lost America. And some of the chapters involve some of these men, but I'll just name a few of these British commanders: John Burgoyne, William Howe, Henry Clinton, Charles Cornwallis. Pick one or tell me about all of them, but what is it about their leadership that doesn't meet the moment, or could they never have met the moment?
They're fighting an insurrection across 3,000 miles of open ocean in the age of sail. That's hard. We know how hard it is to fight, even in an age when we've got command of the skies and the seas in a place like Afghanistan or Vietnam or Iraq. Expeditionary warfare is one of the most difficult sorts of martial enterprise to undertake, and never more difficult than in the 18th century, in the age of sail. They and their political masters underestimate the level of commitment to the cause here. They underestimate the capability of Americans to fight to the death. They underestimate the willingness of Americans to decide that there is something for which they're willing to die for. It's the most profound question any people can ask themselves. And the British at home, back in Britain, just don't believe that that is going to cause 8 years of resistance to the crown. When you're fighting an insurrection, when you're waging a counter-insurrection, as we know from Vietnam, from Iraq, from Afghanistan, from history, and particularly when it's an expeditionary counter-insurrection, you have to win. When you're the insurrectionist, you have to not lose. And Washington recognizes this. He's a very aggressive guy. He wants one big titanic battle, mano a mano, to settle everything. And he quickly realizes that he can't go toe-to-toe with the greatest navy the world's ever seen, this very robust, professional British Army. He's got to play strategic defensive. He's got to not lose. The British generals never really come to grips with that, and neither does George III. George Germain, who's the American secretary, he's kind of the Robert McNamara of the war for the British, or the rest of the British leadership in London.
You mentioned some of the things the British leadership overestimated. One thing that they underestimated, the willingness of the Americans. One thing perhaps they overestimated, based on my reading here, is the potential or the likelihood that loyalist Americans would join the fight. And you point out that they never quite figured out how to get, John Adams once said a third of the American people were loyalists. I think modern numbers are not nearly that high, but what happens to fail to garner that kind of support and to rally those who wanted to be loyal to the king but never seemed to mass in numbers?
Yeah, well, there are 2.5 million Americans when the war begins in 1775. 500,000 of them are enslaved blacks. Of the other 2 million whites, modern scholarship shows that about 18 to 20% were loyalists, committed to the crown in a substantial way. There's a lot of fence straddling. There's a lot of people who shift back and forth, as is always the case. But it becomes a civil war very quickly. It's our first civil war, and it's as nasty as all civil wars are. It really anticipates the Civil War. The British believe, starting with the king, that there is a deep reservoir of loyal commitment to the crown, and that all that's required to unshackle these loyalists waiting to come out is for the British military to show that they're there and going to teach the rascals a lesson. Well, it doesn't work. It's much more complicated than that. For one thing, you're fighting all the way from Georgia to Maine. The British don't really understand that geography, how huge it is. And so even though the British Army at one point has more than 50,000 troops here, including ultimately 30,000 German mercenaries, it's not nearly enough to command the ground in that huge battle space between northern New England and the Deep South. They're expecting loyalists to rally to them when they come to places like South Carolina, and some do. But when they leave to go fight someplace else, then the rebels do what rebels do. You can think of the militia, which is the part-time soldiers. You can think of them as the Taliban. And they're going to come around and they're going to say, Dr. Butterfield, we know you've been friendly with the British while they were here, and you maybe have even signed an oath of allegiance to the king. we're going to take your farm, we're going to kill your cattle, we're going to drive you out of here, we're going to put you in jail, and if you protest, we're going to beat you up, and if you protest more, we're going to hang you. That is a chilling thing for any loyalist to hear, and it happens over and over and over again. It's like that. That's what the war's like. And so the loyalism that the British are counting on, and they count on it to the very end. The king believes virtually until Yorktown in 1781 that there is this reservoir, this silent majority, and it's not there.
I learned here that 81 generals would serve under George Washington over the course of the war. One, if I'm not mistaken, based on reading this, was exceptionally important, and that's General Nathaniel Greene. Tell us about him, why he's important, but he does stand out, at least in my reading of Volume 2 here, as someone who made a world of difference.
Yeah, you're right, Kevin. He's second only to Washington as the indispensable man. He's a lapsed Quaker from Rhode Island. He's an anchor smith. His family, they work iron and they make big things out of iron. And he's got very little military experience. He shows up in Cambridge as Washington takes over the new Continental Army in the summer of 1775. And Washington, among his other attributes, has an excellent eye for subordinate talent. So he recognizes that a 25-year-old overweight Boston bookseller named Henry Knox is going to be the father of American artillery.
See, that shocked me. Henry Knox, large man, towering figure, and I just assumed he was old by the time. My picture, an old man, to find out he was in his mid-20s, it caught me off guard.
Yeah, and he sees Nathaniel Greene, Washington does, at that time I think he's 34, and recognizes that he's got something in him. He's got command presence, he's got, like Washington, a big brain organized for executive action, willingness to take responsibility, willingness to make decisions. The men will do what he asks them to do. The men will do what he orders them to do. And so we see Washington relying increasingly on Greene, never more than at Valley Forge, when in the late winter of 1777-78, when the army is falling apart, as I described, when 2,000 men are dying of disease and malnutrition, he goes to Greene and says, I need you to be my quartermaster general. I need you to be my chief supply officer. Quartermaster general at that time was kind of like a chief of staff / G4, we would call him today, supply officer. And Greene says, I don't want to. Nobody in history has ever heard of a quartermaster general, quote unquote. And Washington says, you gotta. I need you to do it. And so he does it. He does it for about 2.5 years, and he's absolutely brilliant at it. And he puts together a supply system that isn't great, and they're always going to be scratching for everything from horseshoes to morphine or opium. But he does it, and then we're going to see in the third volume here, he goes back to field command. He's released from the agony of being quartermaster general, and he's going to be the principal American commander in the South, where most of the war is fought, the last couple of years of the war. And he is the primary reason that the ultimate victory occurs at Yorktown because of the generalship that he shows. So he's an amazing guy. And the last thing I'll say about him, Kevin, he's a tragic figure too. So Henry Knox, that 25-year-old overweight Boston bookseller, becomes Washington's first Secretary of War. He'd be in fashion again today as we change the Department of Defense. Greene's not around to become one of the founders. He's not around for the Constitutional Convention. He ends up the war broke, as so many of them do. He's got this fabulous wife, Cotty. I think Washington is a bit in love with her, actually. And Congress gives Greene, as a token of appreciation and to help to make him a bit more whole financially, confiscated rebel plantations in Georgia. And so he and Cotty move to Georgia, and he becomes a planter. Well, he's from Rhode Island. He doesn't know how hot it gets in Georgia in the summer. And he's out one day in the summer of like 1786 or 86, I think it is. He's not wearing a hat, and he has sunstroke and dies. He's buried in Savannah. And so he's not around to be one of the founders, as he should have been, because he would have been a large figure then. The next time you're in Savannah, go pay tribute to him at his grave.
We have microphones in both aisles, and I'm ready for questions from all of you. If any questions you have, just come on up to the microphone, and we'll go right to it, because I see you getting there quite quickly, sir. On my right.
Thank you. One of the interesting trends in history over the last few years has been that there's been a kind of an outpouring of research on South Asia. And one of the implications of a lot of this is that American writing about the revolution overplays the importance of this to Great Britain. What is said is that the British during this period were really preoccupied by keeping the French out of India. That was the main thing on their plate, and that the American Revolution was really quite a secondary issue to the Brits. What do you think about that argument?
India is in play. The French and the British are tussling over it as imperial powers. It's not going well for the French in India during the American Revolution. I don't think that is a prime factor in British decision-making. Britain is trying to preserve an empire that has been created with their triumph over France in 1763 at the end of the 7 Years' War. And it has brought, as victory often does, complications that they don't really anticipate and don't really know how to handle. And it includes the creation of the first British Empire. The French forfeit Canada. They forfeit 500 million fertile acres west of the Appalachian Mountains. They forfeit several sugar islands in the West Indies, where the real money is. They forfeit part of their holdings in India. And so now Britain has to figure out how to consolidate all of this and pay for it. They're deeply in debt as a consequence of the war that they fought against France and Spain. The French are also deeply in debt. And so they're going to impose taxes on the colonists in America. This causes trouble, as you may know. And the collateral consequences ultimately are going to lead to Lexington and Concord in 1775. So when the French come into it full bore and declare war, and Spain comes in too, because the French and the Spanish are joined at the hip as Bourbon brothers, and then the Dutch are going to come into it. And there are other European powers that are supporting our cause, not overtly, but covertly. Britain's task at that point, India, yeah, whatever. Their task at that point is to avoid the destruction of Britain, not just the empire. I described in some detail in the summer of 1779, Englishmen wake up on the south coast of England, look out, and there is a fleet bigger than the Spanish Armada off the southern coast of England. And it is a Spanish and French fleet intent on invading England. This is existential for them. So the reasons for fighting become, to preserve not just the empire, but to preserve the home island. It changes quite dramatically. And yeah, India is part of it, and Gibraltar is certainly part of it. The Spanish really want to reclaim Gibraltar, Majorca. There's a lot of jostling for the bits and pieces around the map. But for the British, ultimately, the war is fought about preserving Britain.
Let's go to our left here.
Thank you. I'm wondering, in your years and years of studying, what you have learned about what citizens knew as you describe the ups and downs, compared to we know the middle names and the favorite colors of the B-2 pilots that dropped the bombs, back then that was a little bit different, but what did the average person know about in these low points, and how did they react?
They're pretty well informed, actually. There are lots of newspapers. The newspapers actually print the truth sometimes. There are dispatches of one sort or another, and so when there are, disasters, as in Charleston in May of 1780, people know about it. It takes a while to get there. It takes weeks for news to travel the length of the eastern seaboard. What do they think about it? They're alternately depressed and elated. The mood of the country goes up and down. It's not just related to battlefield issues. The currency is absolutely worthless by 1779. Not worth a continental is literally true. The continental dollar is not worth the paper it's printed on. This makes barter comes back in fashion, just trying to keep alive, trying to find a way to sustain your family becomes a perilous thing for many, many, many Americans. So they're watching, they're generally committed to the cause to the end, but it waxes and wanes. And part of the job of the Continental Army, Washington in particular, is he's the long pole in the tent. It's the aspirations of the cause are predicated on success or failure of the Continental Army.
Do you have any new perspectives on the hero of Saratoga, Benedict Arnold? In particular, what happens to Arnold after the war is over? He goes back to England. I never hear about what happens to him.
Yeah.
Whether he's trusted by the British, stays in the army, or just what happens.
Yeah, I'll keep it short because we could talk all night about Arnold. I mean, Arnold is a fascinating character. He is the best tactical leader on either side the first 2 years of the war. He is born to lead other men in the dark of night. That is a real gift. And he shows this over and over again. Washington recognizes immediately that this is a guy who will fight and knows how to fight, and he knows how to lead. He's involved in one of the great expeditions in American military history. He leads 1,000 men through the Maine wilderness to attack Quebec in the winter of 1776, 1775, 76. He's badly wounded at Quebec. And then at Saratoga, he does fight heroically. He's the main battle commander in the thick of the fight, and he's badly wounded again. Both times he's shot in the left leg. The second time, he's in the hospital for months. He's a very easily rattled individual. He's not a stable person. And he believes that he is underappreciated by Congress, which he is. He believes that lesser men are constantly nipping at his heels, because they are. He marries a woman in Philadelphia whose family have loyalist sympathies, and he begins to nurse his grievances to the point that he's thinking of treason. And he engages in a treasonous correspondence that spins forward, and so that in 1780, when he is given command of the fortress at West Point, which is the most important fortress in America, he's going to sell it for 10,000 pounds. It goes bad. As you probably know, his intermediary, Major John Andre, is captured. The plans of West Point are found in his shoes. Arnold has to flee, manages to get away. He's given a commission as a British brigadier general. And he comes back and he's going to attack tidewater areas in Virginia, and he's a bad news adversary. And he's going to again attack his home state in Connecticut at the end of the war. He's going to end up back in Britain. Two of his sons, I think, become British generals ultimately. He's never completely trusted by the British. And even though he's got his moments and he gets his money, he lives in a kind of netherworld in London after the war. And is, his name becomes synonymous with treason. And the British recognize this, so they don't really embrace him. He's a very tragic figure.
Go to a few more.
So you mentioned, I think, that a fifth of the American population was enslaved. So I was wondering if you could discuss maybe the effect of that on the war, either politically or militarily, whichever.
Yeah, I mean, it's an issue throughout the war. It's an issue early in the war because the British governor of Virginia, the last British governor, Lord Dunmore, offers to free slaves of any rebels who will come over to the British side and fight in what Dunmore calls his Ethiopian Corps. Nothing outrages George Washington and the other planters, including Jefferson and Mason, than this affront to the way they do things in Virginia. And this outrage is shared by the whole planter class throughout the South. It doesn't work, it doesn't go well for those who do it, the slaves who run away. Smallpox runs through the Ethiopian Corps and elsewhere, and it's catastrophic for them. The Americans contemplate, Rhode Island creates a largely black unit, one regiment of blacks and what are called mulattoes, and there's some Indians in it, and they fight with some success, but they're a very small part of the cause. And in Charleston, when Charleston is besieged, there's a guy named John Lawrence. If you've seen Hamilton, you know John Lawrence as a character. John Lawrence, his father, Henry Lawrence, has been president of the Continental Congress. Henry Lawrence has made his enormous fortune by being the largest slave trader in America from Charleston. John, his son, is educated in Britain and Switzerland, and he is an abolitionist. And John tries to persuade the South Carolina legislature to allow blacks to fight on the side of the rebellion in exchange, ultimately, after the war, for their freedom. And the South Carolina legislature says not only no, they say hell no, never. South Carolina falls, Army of 5,000 collapses. So, the war for enslaved Americans is there are pawns moved back and forth. For black Americans, for Indians, the war is generally a disaster. Because if you're black, and what happens, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights. It doesn't apply to you. Also doesn't apply to women. It doesn't apply to Native Americans. It doesn't apply to indigents. And so we got this new nation, this new republic, but we got a long way to go. And so the American Revolution, it's one of mankind's greatest achievements, creating the American Republic, but it's a work in progress, and still is and will be for the rest of our lives.
And I'm afraid we've just run out of time, so join me in thanking Rick Atkinson.